title of our panel is Embedding the Writing Center in First Year Composition with the Digital. And what we really want to talk about here is a version of a mainstreaming initiative that we're now in our third year on. And so we have people who play three different kinds of roles in that initiative. And so we kind of offer, I wouldn't say it's quite three different perspectives because they are kind of overlapping, but I direct first year composition at the University of New England. My colleague Gennaco teaches first year composition, but she also works in our Student Academic Success Center on writing support for first year composition, and so she plays sort of a teacher and a kind of a tutor / writing consultant role. And then Eric Drown, the third member of the panel, is the developmental writing supervisor. So he sort of handles the student support side. What we call it 011, which is the student support piece of our mainstreaming initiative. So give you I think probably most, if not all of you are aware of this, sort of the traditional model for basic writers starts with, a lot of the times these days, a no-credit version of basic writing. So students come in, they're labeled in some way through some kind of a placement as basic writers in need of developmental coursework before they can take freshman writing like everybody else. So they take a pre-college composition course and then they go into freshman writing. Problems with that: one, a lot of places that doesn't count towards graduation. So they come in, you're ready, you're not ready. It kind of can slow progress towards degree. It gets labeled and is at risk of being sort of treated as a kind of really much a remedial kind of thing, a sentence construction, paragraph construction kind of course, kind of gets labeled bonehead English. And this really can set students up in a lot of bad ways. It reinforces a lot of what they've been told already about themselves as writers and as learners, which can create real challenges for them to sort of acclimate to the university and be successful. So this challenge has manifested in very concrete ways at the University of New England, where we all work. And so we've sort of looked at this problem over a number of years. 3 years ago, we created an alternative to this model that we call mainstreaming. On our campus, what we saw was the students who were placed into basic writing before we had this initiative, their year 1 to year 2 retention was 10 to 15 points below the overall retention rate for our freshmen. So that's a pretty, at a private university, a small private university without an endowment, it's really much tuition-driven kind of place, that's a big number. And so any gains you can make to improve that 10 to 15% can pay real dividends in terms of tuition, and of course that's good for students to have success and continue in college. And part of the problem with the retention is that the more sort of courses you have to go through before you get into college level work, the more you can feel like you're not really ready for college, and that's sort of one of the many reasons students might take the off-ramp and exit the university. So in developing this initiative, which we call mainstreaming, we looked at basically the types of mainstreaming approaches that are very common today, over the emerged, say, some of them date older than this, but maybe over the last 20 years. The first one, I think UConn has a writing studio kind of model. I may be mistaken about that. They used to have one. I think they still do. But the writing studio model for mainstreaming basic writers says, you're in first year composition, but you take some additional supplemental kind of course, a studio kind of course where you work with a smaller group of students, other students who are like you who are developmental, on maybe study skills, but also some of the work of that first year composition course. So you might be in a regular freshman writing course with a bunch of other students, and then some group of you then take a section, a studio section, in addition to that, to support your work in that regular freshman course. So that's one kind of approach that we often see. Another is this idea of jumbo composition. So and studio maybe is maybe some kind of a version of that, but basically you sort of add a bunch of credits. So the students are spending more time on task in the work of writing development, in the work of freshman composition. Maybe it's 6 credits in the first semester kind of thing, to kind of jump Kickstarter, right? Instead of taking 5 different things, let's focus on a lot of your attention on writing development and jumbo composition. And another model that you see is this idea of stretch composition. So let's take the first year composition course. It's not that students can't do it, but they need more support, right? So let's create, they'll have a real first year composition course, but we're going to stretch it out over a full year. And then this is a mainstreaming initiative that's become very well known in the last, I'd say 5 to 6 years, the accelerated learning program approach, which is, I kind of describe that as, I guess it's some kind of a version of studio / jumbo kind of mainstreaming. These students are, you have a section of freshman composition, a first-year composition, and a group of those students, say it's something like 5 seats in that first-year composition course, are reserved for the accelerated learners, and those students then are connected with another course that meets right after their first-year composition class, typically. So these are some of the models that we were kind of looking at as we developed our approach. And the one that we adopted is sort of something of a hybrid of those approaches. So students take first-year composition at our institution. It's a 4-credit course. They take first-year composition and they enroll simultaneously in a 1-credit course we call Engaging with Text Writing Lab. So they're taking 5 credits. So it's a 4+1. And one of the things that they do is they sign up for any section of first-year composition that fits their schedule. So we don't reserve seats in comp. We don't say no more than 5, no fewer than 2, whatever. They take whatever section fits their schedule, and they register for Writing Lab 011, which is offered TBA, which means that so they don't have to actually say, I'm going to take the section that meets Tuesday at 2 p.m. They just register for Writing Lab, and then they actually work with the Student Academic Success Center on scheduling the time that works for them. The other thing we do is we limit them to 3 other content area courses. So they're taking 4 content areas. So this is the other piece of the mainstreaming. And the other, another key of this is that the Writing Lab work, this 1-credit sort of support, is connected very closely with the work they're doing in their first-year composition course. So it's not really like a radical alternative or anything like that to existing mainstreaming models. It's just a particularly locally developed one. And so the other thing that we have here is that, so the students are registering. So if I have a first-year composition section, I might have 4 students. Let's say I have 5 students in my first-year composition course who are developmental writers and are required to take this mainstreaming approach. So I've got 5 of them in there. Hypothetically, let's just say Jennifer is supporting my class. So Jen supports my class. She will have all 5 of my mainstreaming students. Okay, so they will meet with her, and she and I are in conversation about the assignments, about the students' development, about things to work on, that kind of stuff. And this is where the digital comes into play, one place where the digital comes into play. So structurally, I guess a picture would look like this. So 20 students, up to 6 of them, roughly in a section of first-year composition, which is capped at 20. One of the things that's important to know is that, so Jen might meet with 1 student in a session, but she might have a session that's doubled up with, say, 2 students, or she might have, so there may be 3 students from my class who come to see her at the same time. So it starts to look like a studio model. In this case, it sort of looks a little more like individual tutoring in this thing. But so she might have 3 meetings with different sort of clusters of students who are in the mainstreaming initiative. And Eric, I think maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But so the focus we want to really sort of focus on is the sort of mechanisms for collaboration. How do the 011 instructor or the Writing Lab instructor and the first-year comp instructor communicate? And also the concept of a curriculum. What does a Writing Lab curriculum look like? What does writing support look like when it's connected to an actual class in this way? It looks a little different from just your standard kind of writing center tutoring model. But so we've been doing this is our 3rd year on with this mainstreaming initiative, and so this is just some of the data we have on outcomes, because it's really, if the goal of this is to support developmental writers and have them achieve success in the university, having that happen is a kind of a sign that maybe something's working. So what we saw was in the first year of this initiative, we took our first-year developmental writers, the mainstreaming student population, and we moved them from their first-year average GPA, from being below the average GPA for the typical entering student at the University of New England, to being statistically on par with them. So it's a little bit low, but you do a statistical analysis and it erases the difference. And so the GPA of these students is now, has risen, the overall GPA, not just in the comp class, not just in the first-year comp class. And this was replicated in the 2nd year. We'll see some data on this in the fall about year 3. So what we've done is we've, in terms of GPA, which is one indicator of success, we've helped them to raise their GPA. And we haven't done it because we've changed the standard for what counts as passing in first-year composition courses. The second thing, and this is really important, if basic writing poses sort of real retention challenges for students who enter the university somewhat at risk, what we've done is, I think it was year one, I think it was a 10-point gain in first-year retention for this cohort, the students whose placement cohort is this mainstreaming, a 10-point gain over the previous sort of retention average for that cohort. And I think it's like 7.2, something like this in year two. So it's a significant bump in retention for this group of students, bringing retention to something pretty close to the overall first-year retention at the university. We've also seen, even though we say that you only take 4 content area courses, what we've seen, so we've reduced the load, the credit load that students take in the fall term, right? Even though we've seen that, over the course of the first academic year, they actually complete more credits towards degree. So at the end of the year, they can look back and say, wow, I mean, they don't know that they've made more progress than people who went through in years previous, but that's pretty good. They're not quite completing the number of credits that their first year peers are completing, but they're like within, it's like 28.6 and 28.9, 29.1, something like they're really close to the overall first year credit completion. And then we do our own first year comp, we do our own outcomes assessment on our learning outcomes, looking at student portfolios, and we have some other metrics that we look at. And what we're seeing, I don't want to get into the details of this because this is a different kind of talk, but what we're seeing is the outcomes, the gains that these mainstreaming students are making are roughly on par with at the end of the course, they're on some of the things we look at, they're statistically indistinguishable. Their scores are statistically indistinguishable from the non-mainstreaming students. So we put them in with real freshmen, give them a real freshman class, give them a little bit of support, and at the end of the term, they look like real freshmen. So here's some of the one of the challenges with this project is we have, so I'm in the College of Arts and Sciences, I'm a faculty member in the English department, the developmental writing supervisor, Eric Drown, who oversees the writing lab piece of this, is in the Student Academic Success Center, which is not in the academic house, it's in the Student Affairs house. And so this creates some challenges, the institutional location poses some challenges. And I think, and I don't want to go too much into this, but I think there's also this challenge of when are you teaching and when are you tutoring? Right? Is the fact that they're taking this course, it's a credit course, a 1-credit course, it has a curriculum, is that tutoring, and what does that look like? Eric's going to talk a bit about that. One of the real challenges here also is that we have, one of the key things is I do not tutor, or I do not teach the 011 students who are in my class. It's just one of the mechanisms that we have. So Jennifer's going to be able to talk about this. Jen teaches first year composition and she teaches our writing lab course. But the writing lab students she has are not her students, right? So she has another writing lab instructor who handles her students. And so this necessitates a kind of collaboration, which poses some challenges and creates some real opportunities. And I think Jen's going to talk a bit about that. So the teaching versus tutoring piece plays out a lot in like starting to rethink what tutoring, what the role of writing support might look like at a university in a model like this, and Eric's going to talk a lot about that. I don't want to get too much into the digital tools piece here right now. I think Jen's going to talk a bit about that. Maybe in the Q&A we'll talk about this. But there's a little bit of a history here. So I arrived at the University of New England in 2010. I was the first director of composition, and I saw this problem. Right? The first year comp is in the academic house, student support is in the student affairs house. And so there's writing tutoring happening, but the writing faculty teaching first year comp didn't know that students were being tutored, what kind of tutoring was happening. There were no real conversations going on around that. So we started to try to have conversations. One of the first things that we created was this. I thought it was really innovative, I thought it was going to be great, it was going to change the world. We created a set of forms, the tutor-teacher communication forms, and they were PDFs, form-fillable PDFs. And basically where an instructor could say, I want Bobby, I'd really like you to get tutoring, I think you'd really benefit from that, I want you to focus on this, this, and this. And you fill out the form, there's room for like text, to enter text, but also to check off things like work on revision, work on subject-verb agreement, work on documentation, work on reading. reading comprehension, right? Right, so you could check little boxes, and then you'd send that form, you give a copy of that form to Bobby, and send him off to get tutoring, and you could shoot that form over to the Student Academic Success Center, so that when Bobby arrived, his tutor had a sense of what his instructor wanted him to work on. And then the idea would be the tutor would meet with Bobby, work on X, Y, and Z, whatever it was in the session, and then quickly fill out the form and send it back to the instructor saying, hey, Bobby came to see me, isn't that great? We worked on this week. If there's something else you'd like to work on, let's send it back, right? So it was beautiful. I mean, they were like married, it was like wonderful, and nobody used it. So here's the digital, electronic, we thought it was gonna be great. I mean, we still have the forms. I still think they're pretty cool forms, but this is a case where the digital doesn't solve a problem, right? And we had a couple other things going on. So one of the things that we've done in the last few years is we've really sort of moved in a direction, not across the board in first year comp, but a lot of us have moved to using Google Docs. So students are writing on Google Docs, they're doing peer review through Google Docs, they're sharing docs with their professor through Google Docs, and Google Docs has the possibility of helping us with this collaboration between first year composition and writing lab. And Jen's going to talk a little bit about that. There's some problems with that, but some real benefits too. And then, of course, the basic digital tool. If you're going to collaborate, you've got somebody who's in a totally different building, on campus on different days from you, who's seeing your students, and then you're there, but that person, you're on campus, but that person's not on campus. It seems like digitally, email would be a nice thing. Met with Bobby today, we worked on this. Oh, great, could you continue to work on that? So that's another possible digital tool, and we found that there are some challenges with that as well, just in practice. So this is where we're at on the, so these are some of the sort of pieces of the digital that come into this project. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jen. She's going to talk about what she does.
All right, great, thank you. Hi, I'm Jen Gennaco. Thank you for choosing our session. It's nice not to talk to emptiness. So I come in to the University of New England as an adjunct, and so any adjuncts in the house today? No? All right, well, let me give you a little bit of that perspective. So adjuncts are part-time, and we often, I would say pretty much everyone I know who's an adjunct works at several campuses. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 2 campuses plus some other project that they work on. So one of the things that I found to be most challenging was when I would come to a campus, and I've worked on a few in the area, and not know really where anything was. You know the person who hired you, who, as Michael pointed out, sometimes has a completely different schedule from your own. And so you might have, a few contact people that you can think, okay, I can go to this person to ask some questions. I've been at UNE for about 7 years now, and so now I have a pretty good base of, who to ask for what, and, knowing a little bit more about that. But what I found was a challenge, especially in playing these different roles, was really feeling like I was connected to a campus, right? Because, if you're part-time at several places, it's hard to really feel like you're part of any one thing, right? And so here at UNE, I feel like I've finally found some of that, and part of that has to do with taking on that variety of roles. So before this program started, the SAS 011, Michael has offered out different opportunities for us to work in collaboration. Typically, it's a one day before the term starts. We talk about a few things going on and some things, around the bigger picture stuff, right? So that one day was great, and it was always interesting to hear what other people were doing, and maybe I'd pick up a pointer or two. But the difference between that and the SAS 011 was that I suddenly became part of that process. It wasn't just hey, that sounds cool what you're doing in Google Docs, or that sounds interesting what you did with this kind of a text. It was every week I'm meeting with students, and I'm actually doing their coursework too, right? So not writing the papers, but reading the readings, looking at the prompt, trying to understand with my perspective how to help them move forward. So that really created a huge amount of opportunity for me to learn from my colleagues in a way that I hadn't had the opportunity to do at that point, or to that point, right? Because it felt really like I could see where those students were struggling, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, about some of the other kind of professional development that felt like for me. So I just wanted to point out too, when we look at that, the scheduling, all of us have taught English 110, and so we're all familiar with the course goals, and yet I think the beauty of it is we all bring our own expertise and our loves to the course. So it was really interesting for me to work with my colleague who is a poet and a writer, my colleague who edits a literary magazine, so bringing those different perspectives helped me to understand things like, wow, look at this reading that he's pairing this with this. Oh, that's interesting, so now I'm doing some of that mental work that I'm expecting my students to do. And I think the other part that I really just want to highlight in this process is that, when we teach freshman composition students, we really ask them to push themselves. We ask them to go out on a limb. We ask them to work with each other, to do peer review, to give meaningful feedback, and to sometimes be uncomfortable in that. And it occurred to me that we don't often ask ourselves to do that. we know we have to work with peers and that, but this was an opportunity for me to feel like I was pushing myself a little bit more, because now I'm in this really different role, right? I am a colleague, and yet I have the opportunity to offer my colleagues some feedback about what their students are telling me. And also, I bring my own perspective, right? I've been through this, I know what the cycle is, the 15 weeks, run to midterm, and then how are we gonna make it to the end, and so I have this sense of that pacing, but it also allowed me to look at what other people were doing and potentially offer some collaboration, right? So in small ways and bigger ways, through the course of the semester, I was able to talk with people and say, how, so we are going to do this project next, okay, we talked about that project, and it allowed us to sort of work through some things in the same way that we ask our writers to do that peer review, to trust one another a little bit, to go out on a limb sometimes. And maybe I'm still working on the critical part because that's a little harder, but to try to help move somebody forward in what they're in reaching their goals. And so that was really helpful to me to be in that role, because I knew that I was also in the role of asking for that help, right? So it wasn't just me saying, hey, Michael, I think this is not really working. It was, now I'm going to have somebody who I'm talking with who's telling me, well, all of your students are really confused about this, so getting that feedback was really important. And also because my students won't tell me that, they'll at the end of the term, you get the person who is really irately mad at you and you didn't even realize, and so there's that moment where you can kind of hopefully head that off, and you can try to get them what they need and understand a little bit more, because they will open up, or at least they have for me, that in that tutoring role more so, because now I'm no longer the person, I'm technically giving a grade, but I'm not the one giving the grade, right? And so what does he want here? I'm the one to help them interpret that. And so that was really interesting for me. So I thought I'd take a moment, since this is about using the digital, to talk a little bit about how that comes into my instruction. So as an English 110 professor, I teach a hybrid. I was lucky enough to be able to design one of our first English 110 hybrid sections. And so I use some of the basic tools. It's nothing earth-shattering, and yet it's functional. Right, so we use Blackboard on our campus, and some of the ways that we use it, I use it for discussion boards and posting homework assignments, supporting documents and links, and the grade book, which, the ever-present grade book, which, students I found really have that need to know, right? So I indulge a little in that, and so then I don't have to, have the many conversations about what's my grade, so that's helpful in that way. This term I've also used Blackboard Collaborate for virtual conferences. Again, as an adjunct, this is really important to me. I live an hour away from campus, so I'm not going to be there if I'm not teaching that day. So but I can be at home and be available via Blackboard Collaborate. So on those weeks where I know students might need some extra support, I can add those extra hours. The interesting thing about this, and 18 and 19-year-olds are typically who we teach, is that most of them don't want to use Blackboard Collaborate. They would rather sit with me one-on-one, which I think is really fascinating. Also because my course, I focus around technology, and we write about technology and the impacts of things like big data and social media usage and technology on reading process and that sort of thing. So I just find it really interesting that almost none of them will sign up for it until I say, okay, it's really not that hard, look, we'll try it in class. You know, so it's been interesting for that. I also use Google Docs, as Michael pointed out. This is something that several of us do use for peer review. I use it also for the full drafting process. The only paper copy that they have to have is for a portfolio that we keep for the end of the term, also as kind of the backup, you know, the just in case sort of model. And then also at the end of the term, it allows them to do a little bit more focused reflection because they're not scrolling through various documents. It's just what they're looking at in front of them. And then finally, things like the library databases. So these are ways that technology is embedded in the English 110 hybrid course, and I think for some of the other courses as well. It's not a requirement, and that also sometimes can pose a little bit of a challenge when it comes to helping students navigate that 110 course. So my role as a writing consultant, again, is significantly different than my role as the English 110 instructor, which was a little bit of a surprise because it's basically the same learning outcomes, but it's in a small group. And my goal with being the writing consultant, having gone through the first cycle of having a writing consultant work with some of my students, and as Michael described, the communication was certainly a challenge. Again, both of us were part-time. We had opposite schedules. I would try to call, it would be there's a student there, or she would send me an email. It would happen once every 3 weeks instead of every week. And so when I took that role on, I sort of made it part of my expectation that I am a support person, but not just for students, that I am a support person also for the professor that I'm working with. So for students, I targeted instruction and reinforcement of the key concepts to reach the course goals, because I know those course goals and I know how I do that, and I help them through that. Sometimes offering a method that they hadn't tried in English 110 that happened to work for them. Sometimes it didn't work for them, but we tried it anyway, so that was good. Structure for working through difficulties and keeping the growth mindset. For me, this was kind of the surprise of this role, was that I learned a lot more about those students than I expected to, because I saw them once a week, and when they would come in, they were a bit more open, I think, than they would be in class. It was just either two of us or three of us in a group, and so we had a lot of conversations about homesickness. I miss my dog. There was lots of crying involved, not by me, luckily, but. I say lots, but there were a few instances of crying, and so it gave me the opportunity to be the person on campus who could direct them to some of the things that they might need, right? Not just through English 110, but so what do you think you're going to do about this? How can you work through this? Your peer review was a disaster. Now what do you do, right? And so they were able to give me some of that frustration and try to work through a plan. And one of the focuses that I kept in I actually started with in SAS 011, which is the writing tutorial, was to start with reading about growth mindset and recognizing that there are things that are going to happen in college in English 110 where it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. Just because you didn't get a great grade the first time doesn't mean you're a failure. Everybody has the option and the ability to be able to learn. So let's figure out how you learn best, and let's work with that. Let me guide you through that. Let me help you with that. And once we set that expectation, and again, a lot of these writers come in with baggage. They've been told they're not very good at something. They're doing this grudgingly, a lot of them, at least at the beginning, hopefully not at the end. But so that allowed me that role to kind of be a real true support to them beyond just the English 110 work that we were doing. And it was also simple things like technological things, where to go in the library to find things, who to talk with if you had this kind of a problem, right? So that was helpful, I think, to them. Finally, deconstruction of reading prompts and professor comments. And again, this was really tricky sometimes because when my students would come in and show me the feedback they had received, they really focused in on those things that they could unpack, those things that they understood, things that maybe were perhaps grammar related or sentence structure, that sort of stuff, because that's what they understood. And so when I asked them what they got from feedback, that's what they would focus in on, regardless of the other 10 comments that were about other things, claims and evidence and that sort of thing. So it also allowed me that option to walk them through that process of, okay, so I know you do this in class and you looked at your paper and you've read these comments, but now let's look at what we can do with those comments. What do we do with it for next time? And that move to help them go through that and actually say, okay, what am I going to do with it for next time? We would make a couple of times through the semester. So writing this second paper, let's look at what you got for feedback on your first paper. Where were the problem areas? Did you address those kind of areas? And that step, I think a lot of them either didn't think to take, or maybe they were coached to take it but didn't take it, so it was some real interesting work around that. So uses of technology as when I was in the tutoring role, I had students use their Google Docs. They shared it with me and other students, which allowed for us to make a recording of what we did. Essentially, they took some notes, we shared documents, we did more hands-on work in tutorials. So if we were a group of 3, you share with me, I share with you, Joe, you look at this, you look at the evidence. I want you just to look at evidence, paragraph 3, right? And make 2 comments about the evidence. And so what we would do is really target those areas that for the individuals were problematic. So one person might be looking at claims, the other might be looking at evidence, somebody else might be looking at some other element that was particularly troubling for them before that, right? So I could do that individually, and we could do it in small groups using Google Docs, and it was real time. It wasn't passing the paper around that then gets shoved in the backpack that, who knows where it ever comes out again, right? So that was helpful. The real-time editing, again, allowed for better discussion because I could say, hey, that was a great comment you made, Melissa. I really agree with that comment, right? So immediately, and I can put that in the doc, right? So now Joe, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 5 days later, goes back and sees that and says, oh yeah, that's what we were talking about, right? So that was really helpful. Always organized in that way, because that was another thing. When colleagues didn't have that electronic media, which students I think are more used to at this point, when that wasn't available, we would have sessions where the first 10 minutes was somebody digging through their bag trying to find the prompt, right? So that led to another discussion about organization, but still there was that, a lot of lost time in that. And then finally, appointments were recorded via the tutor track system. I don't think Eric's probably going to talk too much about that, but basically it was just a mechanism for when the students came into the academic center, they would record that they were there. And so that sort of took the pressure off of me to have to, I kept a recorded, list of who was there when, but I didn't have to go through any kind of process to do that. It was just for my own records. So as the writing consultant, these are the things that I felt, or that I worked to do for the students. And then finally, I wanted to talk just a little bit about the professional benefits, which again, I've touched a bit on some of them already, but that role of collaboration for me was just so important. Again, it made me feel more connected to my colleagues. These were people who, for the most part, I knew for years, and yet it felt a little risky, right? Not only for them, but for me too, to be able to really see what I could offer as support and for help, but also what I could learn from that. So with the use of technology, interestingly, I would recommend none, because what I found was we connected better either speaking face-to-face in an actual real conversation or talking on the phone. So at the beginning of the term, I set up with the people who I was supporting some sort of meeting expectation. I'm going to meet with you every few weeks, or for a couple of them it was, I will call you at 11 o'clock on Friday. I will call you at 12 o'clock on whatever day, right? I tried to always be the one to initiate that as much as possible because, again, being on the adjunct side of it, I know what it's like to have to balance all of these different expectations. And so if they said, hey, I can't meet right now, I have a student that just showed up, great, well, I'll email you sometime, right? And that was part of my expectation. I took that as part of my job because, again, being on the other side of from before, I knew that that tutor had, I don't want to say a stronger connection, but there was maybe a slightly more in-depth connection, especially at the beginning of the term. So that was information I wanted to make sure they had, and also to help guide me. So I could say to them, what would you like me to work on with Joe this week? I was thinking this, does that sound okay? You know, but I tried to always lead with that. How can I help you this time around, or what's going on for you? What do you want me to do in this process? And I think, again, having that role of not being the one in charge of the content was also kind of freeing, you know, because even though I was working through all of these things with them and hoping that they were going to do great, and sometimes disappointed when they didn't, maybe, again, that some of the different expectations were a little tricky sometimes, but that allowed me the option to kind of let go of that grading part, which was really fabulous. I loved it. So that was interesting too. And then just finally about perspective, what this helped me to do is not just see myself in just that English 110 instructor role, but also as part of a wider circle in the campus. Working at the academic center led me to meet new people at the academic center, or to better create relationships there. And also it helped me to really understand the students' needs, my students' needs in English 110, because you know, I'm focused on getting the first draft by then, and if we don't do that, then this has to happen. Oh no, there's a snow day, you know. So a lot of my goals were around the course, and less so about really seeing what was happening for the students, or maybe keeping them in mind a little bit. So at the beginning of the term, when people were crying about missing home, I took a few minutes at the beginning of English 110 class, and I said, "How are things going with your roommate?" You know, and it was just 5 minutes maybe, but trying to remember that they were dealing with a much bigger transition than just now I have to take this class was really helpful to me to keep that on my radar, particularly post-break and pre-finals, because that was the hardest time for them again. And again, you know, if I were standing at, you know, this week I stood at the front of the class and was looking out there and wondering, you know, how did the break go? Here you all are back, and I'm going to get you back up to speed, and like it or not, and yet, you know, I had that in the back of my mind too, to check in with a few of them who maybe looked like they could use a little bit of extra attention that day. And then finally, considering my expectations and context of other professors, again, as an adjunct, sometimes we don't get the opportunity to see that as much. We don't get to look at the other texts that people are reading. It's not that we can't, it's not that we don't necessarily want to, but it's just that who has the time for that? So unless you schedule that time, it's probably not going to happen. And so this really gave me the opportunity to say, okay, this is now my job, and this is part of my scheduling as I set up my expectations. So I will pass it along to Eric next. He will tell you more about the program, but overall I just, again, want to say that I just found it such a valuable experience, and really would encourage any English 110 professors or you know, freshman writer instructors to branch out a little bit and see how else you can use those skills and grow your understanding of what it means to be a freshman comp instructor. Okay.
Thank you. Jim's telling a story of where we are now with this project, but it's been a work in progress. You know, I think we're in a pretty good place now, in part because we have greater integration and crossover in the roles. You know, Jen, first-year writing instructor and serving as a writing consultant. Until this year, I was a first-year writing instructor, and I've been doing that for 20 years, and I did not come up through the Writing Center community with the Writing Center scholarship, with the Writing Center ideas. I came up with, I'm a first-year composition instructor, you know, there are these learning goals that need to be met, and we need to be able to do those things. And I was one of the people who was really skeptical at the beginning of this relationship between what's happening in the first-year composition program and what's happening in the Student Academic Support Center with writing support, right? Because why? Because the Writing Center people, right? We don't really have a Writing Center, we have this Academic Success Center. The Writing Center people do things really differently. They're a little fuzzy and warm, and that's not me. Right? And so I want to say that there are some persistent ideas in Writing Center scholarship and practice that what we're doing now kind of doesn't fit with. And I think it's important to think about the ways in which we conceptualize writing support and to imagine the ways that folding over and building closer connections between first-year composition and what we think we know about teaching there and what Writing Center people think that they know about teaching writing there. How do we build some bridges and make some connections that are not actually natural, right? And that may actually cause people to have some conflicts in there. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I think the first thing to understand is that there are 4 or 5 big ideas in Writing Center scholarship that emerged in the 1990s as that position the Writing Center as opposed or resistant to the disciplining values of the university. Right? The Writing Center becomes a place where, this isn't a place where we're working on grades. Our job is not to make you, have a better grade on this paper, but to make you a better writer over time. And so therefore, we're not going to worry about what grade you get on that paper for that class. We're just going to help you, deal with the things that you think you can deal with now and move you another step forward. And I think if I had a writing coach, right, and I had 20 years, that would be exactly the approach that I would want them to take with me. But that's not who our students are, right? They have 4, 5, maybe 6 years, hopefully not 6 years, to make a way through our writing program. And if the Writing Center is somebody or a set of people who see themselves as opposed and resistant to some of the disciplining forces of the university, then I think that can be a real tension. And I think one of the moves we've made in this course is to see an alliance between individualized or small group writing support and the learning goals of first-year writing. One of the other big ideas in Writing Center practice and scholarship is that the Writing Center should be cozy. It should be home-like, right? This idea of the Writing Center as a student-centered space opposed to the university came about in part because we were inviting all kinds of new students to the university, telling them that they weren't fit to do what they wanted to, and so the university was kind of a hostile place that was demanding pretty large-scale changes in how you do things, not only in writing, but how you conceive of yourself as an individual. And so if students like that didn't have a home on campus, they wouldn't stay. Right? Great commuter lounge downstairs I saw on the way in, right? Those are the kind of cozy homes, but they have to have coffee makers and couches and nice plants and all those kind of things. And it's true, you can go on the Writing Center listserv and see conversations about, how many plants do I need, right? And what kind of coffee is best in the coffee maker? And it's like, really? That's something, really? So if the Writing Center is supposed to be cozy, it's supposed to be this home away from home for students who feel somewhat shut out by the kind of rigorous work that they're doing in the regular curriculum, that poses the Writing Center, right, as separate space. Usefully, I think, in some ways, but in problematic ways when you're trying to do the kind of things that we're doing, which is to support students and move them through, especially developmental students, move them through a program that's really an entry-level program that opens up the university for them. Stephen North argued famously that the writing curriculum has no curriculum. Right? The Writing Center should have no curriculum. We really need to be focused on the individual needs of that writer. It's like, really? No curriculum? And you start reading about, the hidden curriculum, Gene Anion. We always had a curriculum. It just depends on whether we're going to be explicit about it and whether that's going to be up for grabs or up for negotiation or up for discussion. And I think one of the things Jen points out to you, right, in her discussion of how first-year writing instructors and writing consultants work together is all of a sudden you're having conversations about what the tacit curriculum is, both in first-year writing and in the Writing Center, and you're having them every week, right? You're not having them once at the beginning of the semester and once at the end of the semester for RAVA. You're having them every week. Do you realize that your students are taking 3 hours to work their way through this 8 pages of this article? No, I didn't. I thought that was going to take 40 minutes. Right, yeah, so let's talk about what we're doing here. And then the discussion might be, how much do you value that challenge? Right? What are the supports that they might need to turn that challenge from something that's seen as an overwhelming obstacle into something that actually is going to be productive learning opportunity for them? Miriam Harris is probably, the St. Teresa, Mother Teresa of Writing Center. And her big argument is that tutors aren't teachers and that writing sessions should be one-on-one. And because of that, we should be doing things that fit well within those pedagogies. I think the fact that I started as a composition teacher and moved over into, the Writing Center and became a Writing Center person that way, and that Jen started as a teacher and has become a consultant, has been really both interesting, disruptive, and challenging for our colleagues who lived in the Writing Center before we got there. I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, but one of the reasons I was so skeptical about the possibility of, writing support actually contributing to my students' learning in the class was because of the culture in the Writing Center, which was based really on these useful ideas, but ones that in our particular case and for our particular needs weren't working as well, as much for logistical reasons as cultural reasons or conceptual reasons, and I want to touch on those things as well. I think for me, moving from the first year writing composition classroom into the Writing Center necessitated some new thinking on my part. And for me, the big ideas that have been really enabling over this last year or so, as we've gotten better at making SAS 011 work, are the ideas here, right? That writing courses, they're not just neutral conveyors of information, they're not just skill building places, they're places where students do identity work, right? And where they are recruited or invited or challenged to transform their sense of who they are. And that what we're really doing is trying to sponsor them in some ways into not just one discourse, or two, or one learning community, but maybe 8, right? As they go from course to course to course, and they decide that I might be this major at this point, or 6 weeks later, I'm gonna be another major. And it's like, okay, so you're gonna be a novice here, and you're gonna be a novice here, and you're gonna work your way through, and it's gonna be really, really challenging, and everything looks arbitrary to them, right? This professor wants me to write this way, the tutor's telling me to do it a different way, this other professor is telling me this other thing, no, you don't use this way, red pen, red pen, red pen, red pen, red pen, red pen, right? So I think what's really important about this big idea is that we see writing locations all over campus as places where students are invited in, but they're invited in and not really knowing what they're joining yet. Right? And Nancy Grimm, who many, many years ago was the author of the critique of writing centers as regulatory places, places where we do damage to students, has begun to rethink that. And her big concept is it's really important for newcomers to have access to writing centers, newcomers to discourses who need guidance. They need to have interactions with people who are a little bit more fluent in the discourses than they are. They don't always need somebody to say, so what do you think we should work on? They don't always need somebody to say, the answer's inside you. All we have to do is ask you the right questions and bring it out. Sometimes they need somebody to say, listen, when you move from your humanities class where you're writing an MLA and you're using signal phrases in these ways and an active voice, but when you move into your biology class, you don't use signal phrase this way. You have to switch to passive tense, right? And you have to think about the different ways that you're deploying evidence, right? Those ideas are not already embedded naturally in the ideas of developmental writers in particular, who already have this relationship that Jen points out to learning about writing that says, I can't possibly do this because there are no rules, right? There's no pattern to follow, right? And what we're hoping to get them to see as they work with us as consultants is, here the rules are this. When you move over here, they'll change, right? But what we need for you now in our first year is entry-level novice performance of those things. They don't have to be perfect, they don't have to be beautiful, right? But they do have to be novice-level performances so that, guess what? Next semester, you take another course, you can do novice plus level performance, right? And you'll gain fluency over time. These ideas are really, really not native to the Writing Center way of thinking, right? Which is often local, focused on the student in front of you, right, and focused on the paper in front of you. And why is that? Because that may be the one time you see that student, right? So I think, the most important thing about Writing Lab is that the Writing Lab positions the Writing Center as integral to the curriculum and builds in a long series of meetings between students, instructor, and consultant. And it's that consistency in the meeting that allows for a kind of progress-minded growth orientation rather than an immediate focus on performance, right, which tends to come with Writing Center pedagogy. Jen told you that Writing Lab isn't always cozy. People cry. It's true. People resist. People push back. The hardest form of pushback that I get is the student who sits there and you say, so I think maybe you need to strengthen the evidence in your paper. Okay. So how do you think you might do that? I don't know. right? That's the most challenging kind of student. And so that I had a conversation with a young woman yesterday who's already told me that she's transferring, and she's on her way out, and basically she's checked out, right? That conversation went just the way I showed you. And it's like, you know that when you move to your next university, this isn't going to change, right? This, what we're doing here, it's not idiosyncratic to what we're doing. This is actually part of what it takes in order to become the occupational therapist that you want to become, or the dentist that you want to become, or the sociologist or social worker that you want to become. You're going to have to marshal evidence in support of claims, and so why don't we practice that here where the stakes are low and you have support? Okay. So, it's week 6, week 7. I think by the end of the semester, I might make a little bit of progress with her. But if that was the one opportunity to have that conversation, she doesn't know who I am. She doesn't have any trust that I'm thinking about who she is, right, and what her goals are and what her needs are. I wouldn't know that she was transferring, right? So I couldn't have a substantive conversation with her at that. But that means that writing lab consultants sometimes do things that writing tutors don't often do. Apply pressure, right? Question motivation, right? Push a student out of the comfort zone, right? And I think because we put the Writing Center, in the course, that really helps, writing tutors to feel like they're empowered to be able to push the student in that way. We have learning objectives in the course. Our learning objectives are aligned to the learning objectives in English 110, our first year writing class, but only 2 of the learning objectives, maybe 4 of the learning objectives for our tutorial part of the course are based on what does the student put on paper, right? So one learning objective is how well do you integrate your ideas with others. That one we can see on paper. And the other one is to have students experiment with more complex language structures at the sentence, paragraph, and kind of organizational level. But the other 3 learning objectives for the course are really attitudinal and process-oriented. So one is we want to see you develop growth mindset. Right? We actually have some operationalization of that. We want to see students practice persistence, and we want to see them practice learning. We want to see them practicing metacognition, and we've developed activities, right, that you can only do when you see a student every week over the course of the semester, and we can take half an hour and not work on, some writing technique, but we can spend half an hour on having the student show us evidence, right, of their learning. So growth mindset, writing process, and reading process. Right? And for me, that's where most of the digital comes in, is when students come to me and they want to show me evidence of a sophisticated or robust reading process, what do? They take snapshots, right, of their marked up pages. They bring in, concept maps that they've developed, and then they give me a narrative and a reflection about what this says about their growth from where they were 4 weeks ago, the last time we checked in on these kind of things. This multiplicity of roles that Jen has talked about, I won't say much more on it, but if you think about all those different roles that we play, teacher, consultant, coaches, collaborators, and sponsors, that means that students might see a different part of you, right, every time they come and see you, and you might be playing a different role, and they need to have that consistency, right, and relationship with you in order to accept that flexing that you do there. I think the most important role that we play as, composition instructors who are also consultants is this, that we are those more fluent members of the discourse community for them. So we can model some of the things that we're doing there. And I can also kind of serve as a translation. I'm working with one of Michael's students this week, and she says, I just don't get this paper assignment. It's like, we sent 2 whole class sections where we were asking questions about it, and he was answering them, and people were proposing ideas about what we were doing, and I still have no idea what this paper's about. Okay, so why do you think that is? Well, he's just not good at explaining stuff. Right? And are you sure? And, they're reading about discourse communities, right, in the class. Maybe this is like actually, a discourse disconnect. Well, what do you mean? Well, you're a beginner, right? Yeah. He's not, right? Yeah. So he's asking you to do stuff, and it might actually be, the language of the prompt might actually be very clear to him. Okay, yeah. but you might not know what some of these words mean, or you may not have an experiential or tacit knowledge about the sub-skills that go with those kind of things. And she's like, yeah, so like, you know, I'm acculturating to this discourse and I don't yet see what he's seeing. Yeah, that's right. Right, so she's gaining that language, she's practicing it, but she wouldn't have done it without the push, right? So I was able to say, do you think spending another day talking about what the expectations were on the assignment would have made any difference? No. So what will make a difference? I guess I have to try this out and see what's going on, right? And I think that's the real benefit of separating the role, right? So Michael assigns the assignment, he can't really be the one who helps the student make their way through it. I mean, he can, but that's a really conflicted role for the student, right? Because he's going to then evaluate their paper, right? But whereas I don't have impact on the grade for the paper, I can serve as the member as well, I guess the way I would begin to interpret this assignment prompt is to do it in this way. And then why don't you say what you see, right, in these paragraphs here? And we can keep working towards an approximation over 3 weeks, right? As we see different scaffolded pieces of the assignment start coming together, we get a better sense of what's happening. Yeah, I want to leave some time for conversation among us, so I think I'll probably skip some things. Let me talk a little bit about the culture of professional writing support in our writing center. For years, professional writing support was handled in a traditional tutoring model. So we had half-hour sessions, students came in, they set the agenda, worked on whatever those things were, and then students walked out. When I took over as the developmental writing supervisor this fall, one of the biggest things to do was to figure out how are we going to work together with a staff that I was nervous about, right? Are they going to resist building closer connections? And I was thinking, how are we going to have that meeting? And I could tell them what I was hoping for, and I decided, no, that was a bad idea. Instead, I would listen and say, so what's been going on over here? Tell me what's happening. And one of the things I learned right away was that the 2 or 3 professional writing supports we had to support, how many sections of first year comp?
About 32, 34 a year.
Yeah, and what, like 85, 90, 100 students? Something like that?
Over there?
For
For
011?
the 011, it's about 60, 65.
65 students. So we had professional writing consultants who were handling 30, 35 students and maybe 4 or 5 instructors, right? So the frustrations I had around, I really need the student to work on reading support this week, and then they would come back and say, well, we worked on, editing. What? Why is that happening? We need you to be working on writing support. Why did that happen? It happened because there was no time to do the reading for 5 different sections, right? And then when you had a half an hour session with the student to be able to process the readings well enough for yourself to be able to help them make their way through that. So one of the first changes I made had nothing to do with what are the values that we value. It's like, okay, you're going to teach fewer students, right? And you're going to support fewer instructors. And we're going to hire a couple more people, which is how we got Jen over there to do the work. And we're going to build in prep time for the work that you have to do. And you know what? Communication's really important, and those forms that we tried to work before, they took time to fill out. And if you had to fill them out for 30 students a week, how long would that take? Wow. It's not going to work. So we're going to build in 5 hours a week prep time for you if you're going to support 20, 25 students, and we're going to limit the number of instructors you work for. All of a sudden, the culture of the Writing Center opened up, right, once we changed the logistics of that. And sometimes culture isn't culture. Sometimes culture is, oh my God, I'm drowning, and I have to figure out how to do that. And when we start thinking about the digital, because that's part of what we're talking about today, you have to think about whether the digital is going to be adding to that logistical load or relieving that logistical load. Because the most important thing is opportunities for authentic contact among that triad of instructor, student, and consultant. Yeah, I think that's enough. Okay. Thank you.
So now we have some time for questions.
Not so much a question, observation. What you're describing with the writing center, you're calling it a writing center, but it's a writing lab. And so I got one observation. One is what you're really describing too is what you see in WAC programs with teaching fellows, where you've got a professor of a course who assigns writing, and he's got assigned a fellow who will do a lot of the coaching on the assignment. And the role of that fellow is to help the student succeed at that given assignment. So you've taken that sort of approach, which, and the only difference is, in a way, is that you're doing it in what used to be a writing center. And you've converted the writing center, and this is my question, do you still have students from other courses who come in with help for writing and use the old model? So do you have side by side?
Yes, in fact, but slightly different populations. I mean, I do see many of those students. I was tutoring a chem lab yesterday and a bio lab and a human traditions course yesterday. But we also have, we do have a Writing Fellows program that embeds students in the first year writing program, but also in other courses around the university. And we also have a peer tutoring a group, which is run by actually a different person. And that more traditional writing centers model is definitely being used by the peer tutors who do much of the writing support for other courses.
Okay, so you've got a lot going on.
We do, yeah.
I would say too that the writing fellows that we work with, their role largely depends on the person they work with. So it's not necessarily a defined, this is the way you would do it. It's more, where you said they might be matched, they would be matched through in a section, but they wouldn't necessarily have to work with that person on a weekly basis, or, it's not like, it would be more like the writing center model of, okay, now I'm assigning you have to see, you 10 are going to see me this week when you're doing your conferencing, and you other 10 are going to see the writing fellow, and then we flip it next time, so it allows them to kind of do a little bit more of a drop-in as opposed to the longer term piece. For us, the writing consultants, we only see a certain group, just those certain groups, so we don't have the drop-in piece of that.
You're kind of co-teaching the course.
Yes.
So you're,
I mean, that conception is a big change, right? And it takes some empowering, right? And we also have to shift the first year writing instructors to stop thinking of the writing consultants as service people, and we have to coach the writing consultants to think of themselves as co-teachers who can step up and say, I don't think your assignment design is really working because blah, 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 blah. What can we do? Yeah. And that's can be touchy, right?
Yeah, especially for agile.
Yeah.
so I think what you're saying is, makes a lot of sense, right? So this, I can see how, you can see this as something like curriculum-based peer tutoring. It's not peer tutoring, these are professional tutors. In this case, like a Writing Fellows program. Or I know so I used to be in the City University of New York system, which has a pretty robust graduate level sort of writing fellow type initiative associated with its WAC program. There you have graduate students who are in a marginalized place, right, sort of partnered with faculty oftentimes around writing support for students in their writing courses, or their writing intensive courses, or their courses in disciplines that have a significant amount of writing. I think, I think one of the big, so it does have some real sort of analogs to that, but one of the big differences is the students are in a credit, right? So it's a credit you can fail out, you can, right, and because they're in a credit, it's a credit they're required to go. So I have a writing, so I have in my freshman composition class right now, my writing lab consultant is Eric. So he's got my 011 students, so he sees once a week. And in addition to that, I have a writing fellow connected to my class. And so my writing fellow and I meet typically once a week. We communicate either by email or, and she actually keeps all the Google Docs log. I met with this person, we worked on this, we talk about assignments. So all together now, she's had 4 meetings with students from my composition class all semester. Right now, papers just came back last week, people just write, so maybe that's gonna grow. But the fact that it's structured like once a week you're going to go, and is a key thing. So the other thing to say about, which is really interesting, so the data that I presented about the success of the program, right, the sort of retention, GPA, credit completion, in many respects that predates, right, those gains that are documented there, that predates a good bit of the kind of collaborative work that Jen has just described. So if you go back, a year ago, 2 years ago, so Eric was teaching for me. He was teaching English composition, multiple sections a semester, and he would have a writing consultant connected with his class. And, he sort of briefly expressed those frustrations, and his consultant could express a different set of frustrations, which is, like, I can't do that stuff that he's saying that he wants me to do because I don't have enough time. He described that. So, when I look at it, I think it's really sort of exciting for me because the first 2 years of this initiative, maybe we picked off the low-hanging fruit here. 8-point gain in retention is the low-hanging fruit. What does it look like when you actually get higher up in the tree? And I really don't know, right? So when the curriculum is, I'm really excited to see what the retention is for next year. When the curriculum is, when we're able to take time to focus more on reading, to sort of say, to talk about that as reading strategies in the writing lab work, and to invite the student to say, hey, you know what, why don't you apply those? I'm not working with you on your bio class, but why don't you think about applying that in your bio or in your sociology? And if a student does that, right, if there's a multiplier effect, right, it's not about tutoring the student in the class right now, it's about that in part, but it's about something more. I really don't know where that will go, but that, and you can't, I don't think we could get there. I don't think our Writing Fellows program, and I brought the Writing Fellows program to the University of New England, but I don't think it's capable of yielding that kind of a gain in the way that I think that Jen's description of that kind of collaboration is capable of going even further.
I think that's an interesting point because so at UConn, at the Storrs campus, we have a fellows model where we pair an undergraduate tutor in a course populated by students who are here through student support services, so primarily first-generation underrepresented students at the university. And in the fall, when they take their first-year writing course, they are required as part of that course to meet with their fellow for 50 minutes in groups of 5 every Friday, so they have a lot of face time with the fellow attends class. And it's really interesting because the things that Jen was describing about, being that intermediary person, the experiences, the things that the students will tell you that they don't tell the instructor, all the outcomes are exactly what our undergraduate fellows would say are the same exact things they've experienced that they've talked about, in different presentations. So I think it's really interesting to hear about this, additional layering with a fellow and with somebody teaching this, this one credit course is particularly interesting because I think that also, our fellows are subscribing more to the model that aligns writing centers with first-year comp a little bit more, as Eric, as you were getting to, and some of that earlier research from the writing center, field of writing center studies, I think was an attempt to establish, credentials as writing centers.
Yeah, right.
These institutions that were, or these organizations that were trying to get funding. So I think, our fellows are subscribing more to the sort of outcomes things that you all were talking about, and things like Jackie Gersh-McKinney in her book, Peripheral Visions of the Writing Centers, talks about, breaking down that cozy home metaphor and
Yes.
saying, we need to challenge students, there needs to be some pushing, and how can the Writing Center work with that? Sort of what is the fellow then in your class? Is that an undergraduate student who's
It's a peer tutor,
It's a
right?
peer
So
tutor,
it's an undergraduate. This is a curriculum-based peer tutoring model.
Yeah.
So if you think about WAC and Martisovin, that's the model that's there. And so in my case, it's a student paired with a freshman writing class.
Mhm.
But we have writing fellows who are paired with a history professor, with a sociology professor, et cetera. Those students take a practicum.
Mhm.
They enroll in a 1-credit Writing Fellows practicum course where they're reading about tutoring pedagogy, writing process, how do you engage with this, right? All of that kind of stuff. And then they're paid X number of hours a week for their work, and they offer certain hours and blah blah blah. But it's not like your model, which sounds like they're writing fellows, they're peer fellows, but they're in it sounds, this is why I guess I categorized UConn as having a studio kind of model, right? 5 students out, and they're sort of meeting together in that. But ours is more, it's a less structured kind of fellows model.
I think your point earlier about the 1 credit, it's you're paying for this, you're paying tuition credit, you're required to go, it's a course, whether it's the 1 credit, you can think of it as a 1 credit separate course on paper, or it's a 1 credit attenuated. And you're doing it as a
As a co-rec, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a huge difference. It doesn't sound like your fellows are, when students go see them for that 50 minutes, that they earn anything extra in credit.
So that actually is the second question I have, because right now it's a 4-credit course that students are enrolled in, and attendance at the fellow session is required.
Okay.
And failure to attend results in hurting their grade in terms of usually class participation grade is where most instructors count it. Obviously, if you have undergraduate students leading this thing, I mean, I've overseen the fellows for the last 3 years, so there's a lot of instruction and work with them, but they are sort of autonomously responsible for what happens in that 50-minute session. So a credit situation, I imagine, would be difficult with the university if you have an undergraduate peer fellow in that setting. But it does raise the question of sort of student investment in fellows if they're not getting the credit, even though it's required time, and so my follow-up question was actually about that credit counting towards graduation because of that same problem that you were talking about with developmental or basic writing classes, right? That a lot of times they're 0 credit, so in moving to this model where students are taking the first year composition plus the additional credit. So does it count as an English course? Does it count as an elective? What does that additional 1 credit count?
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll take that. So our course is SAS, Student Academic Success 011, and it doesn't count for graduation.
Okay.
And I want to talk about grades a little bit because your point about motivation, right, coming from the credit bearing you're paying for, and grade is the other motivation for many students, especially or until they get far enough into the discourse to realize they're learning something valuable, right? So one of the things I want to preserve from traditional Writing Center scholarship is that it's not grade driven.
Yeah.
Right, that it's authentic and that students figure out that they're getting something that's worth it. But we do have to give a grade because it's a course, right? So, I've really encouraged my consultants to do as much of that grading based on a progress-based model. Right, so I don't grade papers anymore. I grade learning objectives and progress on learning objectives. So nobody gets a paper in my class that has a letter grade on it. Right? Have you shown me evidence of progress in your growth mindset? Where are you on this scale? Where will you be at the end of the semester? That's what your grade will emerge from. Where are you on emerging complexity in your sentence and paragraph structures? Where are you on evidence of reading? Right? Those are the kinds of things you do. And because we have this progress-based model, and not everybody does it that way, right? But there's a big chunk of that is about effort and growth and all those kind of things. We satisfy the requirement to have a grade. It's a little fuzzy around the edges, but it also preserves that possibility that students are not feeling like when they come in for that 1 credit that they have a grade hanging over their head that's impossible to achieve.
I think that the fuzziness is a little, we're still, for me at least, still trying to work some of that out, so how exactly do I measure this, and what am I going to need to do for individual students, again, without a specific set of, assessments, which is what I would normally, base grades on. It's sort of like it's a different kind of assessment, and I have to adjust a little bit to that too.
Is
So.
it a reflective piece that you score on Blackboard and use the grade book?
So yeah.
Reflect on reaching a mindset level. Or?
Yeah, I do have them do reflection through the term, so it's not, so far I haven't, and I've only taught it this one time, I'll do it again in the fall, but I had them start off with one thing, and then, through the term, we would do short, assignments in class or in our meeting time. But that also creates a little bit of a conflict, because then I'm not, supporting, what's going on in their English 110 class that week, and that makes it, they kind of don't always like that, so I feel like it's a balance that I'm still working to try to find some resolution on.
And we didn't talk about the one other thing that we did too, right, which is we extended the time of the sessions from 30 minutes to 45 minutes for 1 student, an hour for 2 students, or 75 minutes for 3 students, and that gave more time for these kinds of things. And I know one consultant spends the last 5 minutes of every session asking students to write down, what have you learned today, what do you still need to work on? And so we are getting some measures of that. I think, in the consultant side of the house, we're still forming a community. We don't quite know what we're doing yet exactly. We're working our way towards how we're going to assess what our community values are, what we agree. And we've got a technical writer, we've got somebody who started in middle school education, right? We've got me coming out of comp, and we got a poet, and so we got a lot of negotiating and talking to do. And finally, increasingly, we're having those conversations not just among ourselves, but with the first-year writing instructors. We've become part of assessment. We've become part of their professional development, and those community crossovers are yielding we're beginning to yield really, really rich community feelings that we think are gonna be important going forward.
So we are actually a little bit over time. So I want to wrap up.
Can I make one more comment? I know we're wrapping up, but about the one credit piece, which is institutional credit, so it doesn't count towards graduation. And so one of the, I mean, this is probably true at a lot of schools, but one of the pressures we face is we are known in Maine as a health sciences university, and so a lot of those programs are very credit heavy. And there is a sort of a tenuous understanding of the value of freshman writing, and this is true at a lot of schools. But so the discussion about eliminating the semester of developmental coursework immediately sort of risked falling into the, oh great, so students can then get right into their major coursework in the fall semester, right? So they needed that extra. In some ways, they needed that extra support. Honestly, I think in part as a foot in a placeholder to keep like another nursing course from coming in or something like that. So that that one credit helps the plus 3 other courses ends up with completely a full-time load, and to add another one sort of risks putting them over. And so it gives us a lot of benefits, even though it is still the way I like to describe it is. And we're taking the next step on this. There's a whole population of students who is still falling into the developmental coursework model right now, and we were eliminating that problem starting this fall. But the way I describe it is we are eliminating standalone non-degree coursework for basic writers, for developmental writers. So it's no more standalone developmental work. Thank you.
We can thank our presenters.